Hello guys, welcome as we begin our very new topic, very exciting, it's the weather. We already learned a lot about what weather is. We know that weather is literally the condition of the atmosphere at a certain time, at a certain place, right? And we learned this in the last half of the unit in the water cycle. And today we're going to go a step forward and learn about something called the air masses. Now, before we begin, I want you guys to consider this. So have you ever wondered why weather changes dramatically, right? For example, if in the morning it was warm and sunny, you might notice that by afternoon it gets really cold and rainy. Why does this happen, right? So changes in the weather are actually caused by the movement and interaction of something called air masses. Now, air mass is literally what it sounds like. It is a large body of air where temperature and moisture content are kind of similar throughout. We will learn about air masses and how it has an effect on weather. And the reason why we need to learn about this is so that we can predict what kind of weather we might have during certain times of the year, which is again is a very helpful life skill. Now, air masses, as we know from here, are literally the large body of air where temperature and moisture content are similar, right? Now, these obviously are characterized by their moisture content and temperature. And they can further be determined by the area over which air masses form. And these areas are kind of known as source regions. Now, let's take an example as the Gulf of Mexico, right? Now, the Gulf of Mexico, we know that is generally warmer and obviously has a huge water body, right? So when air masses form over this area, when air masses form over the Gulf of Mexico, we can assume that it is also going to be warm and wet because there's going to be a lot of water in this area that is going to evaporate, right? So the area over which the air masses form have a huge impact on the characteristics of that particular air mass, right? Now, obviously, there are a lot of different types of air masses, and each of them are associated with their own source region over which they form. Now, when you're trying to depict or denote an air mass, they are generally represented by two letter symbols. First letter indicates the moisture content that is characteristic of the air mass, which can be either it's dry or it's wet. And the second letter represents the temperature that is characteristic of the air mass, which means it's either warm or hot or cold, and that's what it tells you. Now, obviously, we have moisture and temperature, so we have four different characteristics that we're going to learn about. The first two have to do directly with the moisture content, and the last two over here, the polar and tropical, has to do with the temperature of the air mass. Now, first we have maritime, which is denoted by a lowercase m. This means that the air mass was formed over water and is wet. If it's continental, it is denoted by a lowercase c, and it means that it was formed over land and so is dry. If it's polar, now since polar and tropical have to do with temperature, they are denoted by an uppercase letter. So polar is P and tropical is uppercase T. Now, polar means it is formed over polar regions, literally what it says. This means that it's going to be cold. And tropical means that it was developed over tropical region or over the tropics, which means that it's going to be warm. Now, let's look at this picture right here. Now, this is an image that depicts the air masses that affect weather in the Northern America. And now if you see here, air mass, there are different kinds over here. There's MT, CT, MT, MP, CP. Now these are obviously air masses that have been depicted by two letters. M, as we remember, stands for maritime, and P for polar. This means that this particular air mass was formed over water and is wet, so moisture content is going to be wet. And it was also formed in a polar region, so it's going to be cold. Now that's what this one tells us. Now let's look at another example. Let's look at the one right here, C and T. Obviously the C is lowercase, which means it's going to tell us something about the moisture content. And we know that C stands for continental, which means that it was formed over land, so it's probably dry. And T is uppercase, which means it has to do something with temperature. And T we know stands for tropical, which means it developed over a tropical region, so it's probably warm. The same can be said for each of these different types of air masses. Each of them have two letters, and you can look over here to kind of understand their moisture content and temperature characteristics of each of them. Now, let's look at cold air masses. In America or in the US, the cold weather is mostly influenced by three polar air masses. A CP, which means a continental polar air mass, forms over northern Canada, and that kind of brings the cold winter weather to the America. And in the summer, the CP, or the continental polar air mass, generally brings a cool and dry weather. Now, because it's polar, we know that this air mass is going to give us a cold weather, right? A cooler weather. And because it's continental, we know that it's not going to be very humid, which means it's probably going to be a lot drier than you would imagine. Now, another one over here is an MP air mass. Now, we know that M stands for maritime, which means it's going to be wet because it was formed over water. And P means polar, so it's going to be wet and cold. So this air mass that was formed over the northern Pacific Ocean. Since it is wet, we can imagine that it also brings a lot of rain and snow to the Pacific coast in the winter, and cool and foggy weather in the summer. And finally, we have another MP maritime polar air mass that forms over the northern Atlantic Ocean. And similarly, it also brings cool and cloudy weather and precipitation. If you remember, precipitation is the way in which we get the water that we lost to evaporation back to the surface of the earth. So it can be in the form of rain, sleet, hail, or snow. And we know about the cold air masses, so obviously there's also warm air masses. Now, warm air masses, we have 4 of those which influence our weather in the America. We have MT air mass, which means it's maritime and tropical. Tropical means it's going to be warm, and maritime is going to be wet. So it's kind of a wet and hot kind of air mass, and it develops over the Pacific Ocean. But it is actually milder than the maritime polar air mass that forms over the Pacific Ocean. Another one that we have is a maritime tropical air mass, wet and hot again. This normally develops over the warm waters of Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. And it moves across the north to the East Coast and into the Midwest. In the summer, obviously, it's going to bring a lot of hot and humid weather because, again, tropical means warm and maritime means wet. So it's going to be a very humid weather. And it often ends up in bringing hurricanes and thunderstorms to these areas. And finally, we have a CT, which means continental tropic. Continental, we know, is going to be dry because it forms over the land. And tropic, we know it's going to be hot because it forms over tropical regions. So these form over the deserts of North Mexico and southwestern USA. This air mass kind of moves northward and brings clear, dry, and hot weather in the summer. And this is all we're going to talk about. Again, if you have any problems, I would suggest that you guys study this diagram carefully, because this will give you a good theory as to how the air masses function. And again, after you watch this video, please go ahead and complete your guided instruction and a guided practice and independent practice. And that's all we're going to do for today. I hope you guys have a great day. I will see you later. Bye.